Somewhere in the forgotten corner of an old American farmstead, there is a patch of soil that has not been planted in over 20 years. No seeds have touched this ground since the early 2000s. No tilling, no transplanting, no annual ritual of starting over from scratch. And yet, every single spring, food emerges from this soil. Thick green spears push through the earth without any human intervention. They rise day after day, week after week, providing fresh harvests for months. The family that owns this land has been eating from this same patch for 2 decades. Their children have grown up harvesting from plants that were established before they were born. This is not magic, this is not a fantasy. This is a category of food that modern agriculture has deliberately pushed to the margins. Plants that survive winter. Plants that return year after year. Plants that ask to be planted only once and then feed families for generations. Your grandparents knew about these crops. Your great-grandparents depended on them. But somewhere between then and now, this knowledge was quietly erased from mainstream gardening and farming. This is the story of the perennial vegetables that the seed industry would rather you forget. Welcome to the vault. Every spring, millions of gardeners across the world perform the same ritual. They buy seeds. They prepare soil. They plant. They water. They wait. They harvest. And then winter comes, the plants die, and the cycle resets to zero. The following year, they do it all again. New seeds, new transplants, new expenses, new labor. An endless loop of starting over that we have been taught to accept as the only way to grow food. But this is not how humans grew food for most of agricultural history. Before the modern seed industry existed, before garden centers sold annual vegetable starts every spring, before the economy of agriculture became dependent on repeat purchases, people grew perennials, plants that survived winter, plants that came back on their own. Plants that became more productive with each passing year rather than dying and demanding replacement. Asparagus is perhaps the most dramatic example. A single asparagus crown, planted once, can produce harvests for 20 to 30 years. Some well-maintained beds have remained productive for 50 years or more. The plant survives freezing winters, goes dormant, stores energy in its roots, and then erupts with fresh spears every spring without any replanting. In the first 2 years, you harvest nothing. You allow the plant to establish its root system. You watch the ferny foliage grow and resist the temptation to pick. This patience is the price of admission. But starting in year 3, the harvest begins. And it does not stop. For decades, the same plants produce food. The crowns grow larger, the spears grow thicker. The yields increase rather than decrease. A mature asparagus bed can produce for a human lifetime. One planting, 20 to 50 years of food. And asparagus is not alone. Rhubarb follows the same pattern. Plant it once and harvest the tart stalks for 20 years or more. The plant asks almost nothing from you. It survives brutal winters. It tolerates neglect. It returns every spring with vigorous new growth. Your grandmother probably had a rhubarb patch. Her grandmother definitely did. The same plants, feeding families across generations. Egyptian walking onions are even more remarkable. These perennial onions produce bulbils at the top of their stalks. When the stalks fall over, the bulbils plant themselves, creating new plants. The onion literally walks across your garden over time, propagating itself without any human help. Plant them once, and they will feed you forever while slowly migrating across your property. Good King Henry was once a staple vegetable across Europe, a perennial green that produces edible leaves, shoots, and seeds. It was so common in medieval England that it grew in almost every cottage garden. Survived winters. It returned every spring. It fed families who had no money to buy seeds annually, and then it vanished from mainstream awareness. Sea kale was a prized delicacy in Victorian England, a perennial that produces tender, blanched shoots in spring. It was served in the finest restaurants. It was cultivated by professional gardeners on wealthy estates. It requires almost no care once established and can live for decades. Today, most people have never heard its name. Perennial kales exist that return year after year. Tree collards can grow for a decade or more. Sorrel, lovage, and Good King Henry provide greens without annual replanting. Sunchokes produce abundant tubers and spread so vigorously that your challenge becomes containing them rather than encouraging them. These plants are not rare, they are not difficult to grow, they are not inferior to annual vegetables. Many of them are more nutritious, more resilient, and more flavorful than their annual counterparts. So why do you not know about them? The answer is economics. But not your economics. The economics of the seed industry. Annual vegetables require you to buy seeds every year. Tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, beans, squash. These plants complete their life cycle in a single season. They produce seeds, they die, and you must start over. Every spring, you return to the store. Every spring, money changes hands. Perennial vegetables break this cycle. You buy them once, you plant them once, and then you never need to buy them again. The plants return on their own. They often spread on their own. They sometimes even plant themselves. From a gardener's perspective, this is perfect. From a seed company's perspective, this is a business problem. There is no recurring revenue in a plant that lives for 30 years. There is no repeat customer when the product lasts a lifetime. The economic incentive points directly away from promoting perennial vegetables, and so they are not promoted. Walk into any garden center in spring. Count the perennial vegetable options versus the annual options. The ratio tells the entire story. Endless varieties of tomatoes that will die in October. Almost no asparagus crowns. Dozens of pepper varieties that require replacement every year. Perhaps one lonely rhubarb plant in the corner. The selection guides your choices. The marketing shapes your knowledge. The system teaches you to garden in a way that requires continuous purchasing. This is not conspiracy. This is not deliberate suppression. This is simply how economic incentives shape cultural knowledge over time. What is profitable gets promoted. What is not profitable gets forgotten. But the forgetting was not always complete. Older gardening books tell a different story. Publications from the early 20th century devote entire chapters to perennial vegetables. They treat asparagus and rhubarb as foundational crops. They discuss Good King Henry and sea kale as standard options. The knowledge existed. The plants were valued. The wisdom was passed down. Somewhere around the mid-20th century, this began to change. The industrialization of agriculture favored annual crops. The rise of commercial seed companies favored repeat purchases. The suburban lawn replaced the productive garden. The knowledge that grandparents held was not passed to grandchildren. Within 2 generations, plants that had fed families for centuries became obscure curiosities known only to dedicated permaculturists and historical gardening enthusiasts. But the plants themselves never disappeared. They are still available. They still grow. They still offer exactly what they always offered. Decades of food from a single planting. The question is whether you will reclaim this knowledge or continue the annual cycle. Consider what a perennial garden actually provides. You plant asparagus this spring. For 2 years you wait. But in year 3, you begin harvesting. And you continue harvesting in year 4, year 5, year 10, year 20. Your children harvest from the same plants. Perhaps your grandchildren. The labor investment pays dividends for decades. The upfront patience converts into years of abundance. The relationship between gardener and plant extends across time rather than resetting to zero every winter. This is how humans gardened for most of history. Not as a consumer purchasing products annually, but as a steward cultivating relationships with plants that lasted lifetimes. Perennial vegetables also offer ecological benefits that annuals cannot match. Their permanent root systems prevent soil erosion. They build soil organic matter year after year. They require less tilling, which preserves soil structure and soil life. They often need less water because their established roots reach deeper. They provide habitat for beneficial insects even when not being actively harvested. A garden built around perennials is more resilient than one dependent on annuals. It survives drought better. It recovers from neglect more easily. It continues producing even when life gets busy and gardening falls down the priority list. Annual gardens punish absence. Miss a few weeks of care and everything suffers. Perennial gardens forgive absence. The plants wait. They persist. They offer second chances. So what do you do with this knowledge? First, understand that starting a perennial garden requires patience. Asparagus needs 2 years before first harvest. Rhubarb needs 1 to 2 years. This initial investment of time discourages gardeners accustomed to the instant gratification of annual vegetables. But the payoff justifies the wait. Second, recognize that perennial vegetables can coexist with annuals. You do not need to choose one or the other. A garden can include tomatoes that die each fall and asparagus that returns each spring. The perennial beds become the foundation, the reliable producers, the crops you never worry about. The annual beds become the space for experimentation and variety. Third, seek out the plants that have been marginalized. Ask for asparagus crowns at your garden center. Request rhubarb roots. Search for Egyptian walking onions, good King Henry, and sea kale from specialty suppliers. Every purchase sends a signal. Every garden that includes perennials helps preserve this knowledge for the next generation. Fourth, learn from the past. Older gardening books contain wisdom that newer ones often lack. Seek out publications from before the annual vegetable dominance became complete. The knowledge your great-grandparents had is not lost. It is waiting in libraries and used bookstores for anyone curious enough to look. Fifth, share what you learn. The reason this knowledge faded is that it stopped being passed down. Break that pattern. Teach your children about perennial vegetables. Give rhubarb divisions to neighbors. Trade asparagus crowns with friends. Knowledge survives through sharing. The plants that feed you every year without replanting are not secrets. They are not forbidden. They are simply forgotten. Pushed to the margins by economic forces that favor annual purchases over permanent plantings. But forgetting is not permanent. What one generation loses, another can reclaim. What was erased from mainstream knowledge can be restored through deliberate effort. Your great-grandparents planted asparagus knowing their grandchildren would harvest from the same crowns. That long-term thinking defined how they related to land and food. It was not about this season. It was about decades of seasons stretching into the future. Modern gardening has mostly abandoned that perspective. We have been taught to think in annual cycles, to accept starting over every year as normal, to buy, plant, harvest, discard, and repeat. But the perennial vegetables still exist, still waiting in specialist nurseries, still growing in the forgotten corners of old farmsteads, still offering what they have always offered. 1. Planting. Decades of food, abundance without the endless cycle of replacement. This is what they stopped teaching in gardening books. This is what the seed industry has no incentive to promote. This is what your grandparents knew, and your parents may have forgotten. And now you know it too. If this changed how you think about growing food, consider subscribing. There are more forgotten practices hiding in plain sight. More questions that modern systems do not encourage you to ask. Welcome to the vault.